The Meridian Cultural Exchange Station hung in space like a testament to galactic cooperation and barely suppressed interspecies condescension. Orbiting the twin suns of the Oltec Kappa system, it represented the galaxy's most ambitious attempt at creating an educational melting pot where different civilizations could share knowledge, cultural perspectives, and elaborate justifications for why their particular brand of evolution was obviously superior to everyone else's. The station's architects had spared no expense in creating an environment that could accommodate the biological and psychological needs of 43 different species. Atmospheric processors maintained 17 different gas mixtures across various decks. Gravity generators could simulate everything from the crushing pull of heavy worlds to the gentle drift of asteroid colonies. Temperature controls ranged from the near-absolute zero preferences of crystalline beings to the molten rock comfort zones of silicon-based life forms. What the architects hadn't planned for was the social ecosystem that would inevitably develop among students who represented the full spectrum of galactic evolution, from species so advanced they had transcended physical form to others who still considered fire a relatively recent technological breakthrough. At the apex of this unofficial hierarchy floated the Seraphim, beings of pure energy who had evolved beyond the inconvenience of physical bodies approximately 50,000 years ago. They attended lectures by manifesting localized electromagnetic disturbances and communicated through quantum fluctuations that roughly translated to "We are very disappointed in all of your primitive material concerns." The fact that they bothered to attend classes at all was considered an act of cosmic charity. Just below them glided the Thalassians, aquatic intellectuals whose homeworld had eliminated scarcity, conflict, and uncomfortable furniture through the simple expedient of building their entire civilization underwater. They had developed philosophy, mathematics, and what they termed transcendent social harmony while floating around in perfectly temperature-controlled oceans, solving disputes through interpretive swimming and never having to worry about anything more threatening than the occasional confused fish. The middle ranks were dominated by the Kytherian collective, a hive mind species that had achieved perfect social cooperation through the biological equivalent of a permanent conference call. They shared thoughts, emotions, and decision-making processes across their entire population, which had eliminated war, crime, and the need for individual responsibility. They approached interspecies relations with the patient condescension of beings who couldn't understand why everyone else insisted on the inefficiency of separate consciousness. And then, occupying the absolute bottom of the academic food chain, were the representatives of what galactic civilization politely termed developmental worlds. These were species from planets where evolution had apparently decided to conduct a comprehensive experiment in creative hostility. Worlds where the local ecology specialized in elaborate methods of converting living beings into component nutrients. Planets where the weather patterns had weaponized themselves and the geological processes had developed a sense of personal vendetta against anything that dared to exist on the surface. The most notorious of these nightmare environments was a little blue-green marble called Earth, officially classified as a Category 12 Deathworld. The classification system went up to Category 15, but those planets were generally considered uninhabitable by anything more complex than extremophile bacteria and perhaps the occasional masochistic mineral deposit. Earth had managed to produce a species that not only survived in this hellscape, but had somehow convinced themselves it was beautiful. Humans wrote poetry about sunsets that occurred on a planet where the atmosphere was poisonous to most civilized life forms. They composed music celebrating seasons that existed only because their world's axial tilt created regular periods of near-lethal temperature variation. They even engaged in recreational activities that involved deliberately exposing themselves to the very environmental hazards that would send most species fleeing for climate-controlled safety. From the perspective of more refined civilizations, humans represented a fascinating case study in adaptive resilience combined with inexplicable aesthetic judgment. They were living proof that intelligence could evolve even under conditions that would make a war zone look like a vacation resort. This combination of factors meant that when humans finally achieved interstellar travel and applied for inclusion in galactic academic programs, they were accepted with the kind of anthropological curiosity typically reserved for particularly interesting bacteria cultures. Nobody expected significant intellectual contributions from a species whose evolutionary history consisted primarily of avoiding being eaten by their own ecosystem, but they made excellent subjects for comparative psychology studies. Which brings us to Raven Mitchell, currently the sole human representative in the Meridian Station's Advanced Theoretical Sciences program. Raven had arrived 8 months ago with academic credentials that had caused several admissions committee members to double-check their translation software. Her test scores in quantum mathematics had been high enough to suggest either a data processing error or the disturbing possibility that Deathworld inhabitants might actually be capable of abstract reasoning. Her research proposals in exotic physics had demonstrated a grasp of theoretical concepts that several professors had privately assumed were beyond the cognitive capabilities of primitives who still lived on planetary surfaces. But there she was, attending seminars on dimensional mechanics, where her questions made seraphim energy patterns flicker with what might have been surprise. She participated in research groups on exotic matter, where her insights earned grudging acknowledgement from Thalassian philosophers. She even managed to contribute meaningfully to Kytherian collective discussions, despite their obvious confusion about how anyone could function with just one consciousness. Her fellow students had responded to this cognitive dissonance in the way that insecure academics always did, by finding elaborate explanations for why her achievements didn't really count. She was remarkably advanced for a Deathworld primitive, or surprisingly capable considering her species' environmental limitations, or possessed of that charming savage ingenuity that occasionally stumbles onto genuine insights. Raven endued these backhanded compliments with the kind of self-control that came from growing up on a planet where emotional outbursts could attract the attention of things with more teeth than seemed anatomically necessary. She attended study sessions where Thalassian classmates explained theoretical concepts she had mastered during her undergraduate work. She participated in cultural exchange programs where seraphim energy beings offered to elevate her consciousness beyond its primitive material constraints. She even smiled politely when Kytherian collective nodes suggested she might benefit from joining their shared mental network to overcome the limitations of individual thought. Through it all, she maintained the practices that connected her to home across the impossible vastness of space. Her daily exercise routine, adapted for the station's variable gravity fields. Her collection of Earth literature, stored in quantum isolation chambers to prevent cultural contamination of more advanced civilizations. Her research into exotic matter applications, which was apparently quite sophisticated for someone from such a hostile environment. And most importantly, her hair. Raven's hair was the color of Earth's night sky and fell in elaborate braids that incorporated patterns passed down through 7 generations of her family. Each morning she rewove the braids according to traditions that told stories of ancestors who had survived impossible odds, of achievements that marked significant life transitions, of hopes and dreams that stretched across the galaxy. The process was meditation, history lesson, and cultural preservation combined into a single daily ritual. To her fellow students, it was simply another quaint primitive custom, rather like the way some species engaged in seasonal molting or performed ritualistic territorial displays. Interesting from an anthropological perspective, but ultimately as meaningful as any other Deathworld superstition. This fundamental misunderstanding was about to become extremely educational for everyone involved. The idea originated with Dex Veranek, a senior Thalassian studying applied xenocultural analysis with a specialization in primitive behavioral patterns in post-scarcity environments. He had been documenting human social customs for his doctoral thesis on vestigial ritual behaviors in technologically emergent species, and Raven's hair maintenance routine had captured his academic attention. She invests approximately 42 minutes daily in decorative cranial fiber arrangement, he informed his research circle during one of their weekly intellectual gatherings. The behavior serves no apparent functional purpose in a controlled environment, yet she maintains the practice with religious consistency. It appears to be a textbook example of evolutionary lag, behavioral programming that persists despite environmental obsolescence. Ilix Nethrian, a Kytherian collective node who specialized in comparative consciousness studies, pulsed thoughtfully through several frequency ranges. Have you considered experimental intervention? If the behavior is genuinely vestigial, disrupting the pattern should produce minimal psychological displacement. If it triggers significant distress, it would confirm emotional attachment to irrational practices. Experimental intervention, Dex repeated, his translator converting his harmonic frequencies into carefully modulated academic interest. You mean deliberate modification of her grooming routine? Nothing excessive, Ilix clarified, their collective consciousness radiating scholarly enthusiasm. a minor structural alteration for comparative analysis. If she demonstrates adaptive flexibility, it supports theories about Deathworld resilience. If she exhibits emotional instability, it confirms primitive attachment to meaningless ritual. The other members of their research circle, 2 additional Thalassians, a Seraphim energy manifestation, and another Kytherian node, considered this proposal with a kind of intellectual excitement that had fueled centuries of ethical violations disguised as academic inquiry. They weren't being malicious, they assured themselves. They were conducting legitimate research into human psychological adaptation patterns. They were contributing to the accumulated knowledge about Deathworld behavioral conditioning. They were absolutely not planning to assault a fellow student for the sake of satisfying their curiosity about primitive emotional responses. Except, of course, that's precisely what they were planning. The multi-species social center occupied 3 full decks of Meridian Station, featuring carefully designed environments that could accommodate the recreational preferences of dozens of different species. The Terran recreation area was a small section that approximated Earth normal atmospheric conditions, gravitational pull, and botanical specimens, a concession to the human exchange program that most students regarded as an amusing novelty. Raven had established a regular study routine in a quiet corner near the synthetic maple trees, where the filtered artificial sunlight provided optimal conditions for reading and the gentle hum of environmental processes created white noise that reminded her of home. She was deep in calculations for her dissertation on exotic matter manipulation when they approached, 6 beings moving with the confident casualness of people who had never considered that their actions might have unintended consequences. "Raven," Dex called out, his aquatic features arranged in what passed for a friendly expression among his species. "We were hoping to engage you in a brief academic discussion." She looked up from her holographic data displays, immediately cataloging the positioning around her study area. Not quite encircling her, but definitely controlling her movement options. Growing up on Earth had taught her to notice predatory positioning. It was an automatic response that had kept her ancestors alive when failing to recognize threat patterns meant becoming someone else's dinner. "What can I help you with?" she asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral while her body shifted into a more balanced stance. "We've been documenting your grooming behaviors for our research into primitive cultural retention," Ilix announced, apparently believing this was a perfectly reasonable conversation opener. "We've developed a hypothesis regarding the functional versus emotional significance of your ham maintenance protocols that we'd like to test." "A hypothesis," Raven repeated slowly, something cold settling in her stomach as she recognized the predatory excitement in their voices. "Regarding whether your behavioral patterns represent genuine adaptive value or merely vestigial emotional programming," one of the Thalassians added helpfully. "We theorize that removing a representative sample would demonstrate the true nature of your psychological attachment mechanisms." "Removing a sample," Raven said, her voice dropping to a register that would have sent every survival-oriented organism within hearing distance looking for immediate shelter. "Of my hair." "Precisely." Dex's enthusiasm was practically radiating through the water-filled environment suit that allowed him to function in standard atmosphere. A minor modification, hardly noticeable. It would provide invaluable data about human adaptability versus primitive ritual dependency. This is where the fundamental miscalculation occurred, though none of them realized it yet. They had committed the classic error that civilized species consistently made when dealing with Deathworld survivors. They had assumed that participating in peaceful academic exchange meant that humans had somehow evolved beyond the survival mechanisms that had kept them alive on the most hostile planet in their databases. Raven identified the neural suppression device in the Seraphim's energy matrix approximately 3 seconds before they intended to activate it. She spotted the restraint field projectors that 2 of the Kytherians were positioning around her chair. She calculated the time required for station security to respond versus the time it would take them to complete their research. Most importantly, she understood exactly what they intended to do, why they believed they could do it, and what they expected her reaction to be. They expected distress, perhaps emotional breakdown, possibly formal complaints to the academic administration. What they absolutely did not expect was for her to recognize this as a predatory assault requiring immediate and overwhelming retaliation. But that's exactly what happened. "You know what?" she said, rising from her chair with the fluid precision that had helped her species survive everything their homeworld had thrown at them. "That's a fascinating research proposal. But I think I have a better experimental design." The neural suppression field activated, but Raven was no longer occupying the space they had targeted. Humans, it turned out, possessed reflexes evolved for evading creatures that moved considerably faster than academic research equipment. She was 6 feet to her right, and moving with a kind of focused lethality that had made Earth's ecosystem such an effective proving ground for intelligent life. "Let's test how you respond to having parts of yourselves removed without informed consent," she continued conversationally, her hand closing around a molecular cutting tool that had been carelessly left near the botanical specimens. The tool was designed for precise trimming of exotic plant matter, with edges that could slice through materials at the subatomic level. It was, coincidentally, exactly the kind of improvised weapon that humans excelled at identifying and employing under pressure. What happened next unfolded with a swift, terrible efficiency that had characterized human survival strategies for millions of years. Raven moved like concentrated violence, struck with surgical precision, and demonstrated exactly why her species had achieved dominance on a planet that specialized in creative methods of killing things. Dex Veranek would later inform the medical reconstruction team that he never perceived the attack approaching. One moment he was observing what he anticipated would be an emotional breakdown from a primitive Deathworld specimen. The next moment he was staring at the severed remains of his primary manipulator appendage, while his luminescent circulatory fluid painted abstract patterns across the Terran recreation area's carefully maintained flora. The molecular cutting tool, designed to slice through the most resilient organic compounds in known space, had made remarkably efficient work of Falashan cartilage and bone structure. "Hypothesis confirmed," Raven announced to the stunned research group, her voice maintaining perfect academic calm despite the predatory stillness that had settled over her entire frame. "When you attempt to modify someone's body without their permission for your intellectual gratification, they tend to object violently." She placed the improvised weapon carefully beside the synthetic roses, where it continued to gleam with what the botanical maintenance systems would later classify as unscheduled biological contamination, requiring immediate sterilization protocols. "The difference between your experiment and mine," she continued, addressing Dex directly as he stared at his severed appendage in shock, "is that I was honest about my intentions." Station security arrived approximately 2.5 minutes later, summoned by biometric alarms indicating that someone had encountered something significantly outside their normal parameters. They discovered 6 alien students in various stages of psychological trauma surrounding one human who was calmly removing plant debris from under her fingernails. "Officers," she greeted them with professional courtesy. "There appears to have been a disagreement regarding research ethics and informed consent protocols in xenocultural studies." The investigation that followed became mandatory reading in interspecies law programs throughout 17 different star systems. The concept of proportional response, it became apparent, varied dramatically between species depending on their evolutionary backgrounds and environmental conditioning. What Raven considered an appropriate reaction to attempted assault, the station administration initially classified as excessive violence by an unstable primitive specimen. This classification lasted exactly until Earth's diplomatic corps became involved in the proceedings. Ambassador Marcus Chen was humanity's leading expert in interspecies jurisprudence, and he had been anticipating a case like this for the better part of 2 decades. He arrived at Meridian Station with a full legal team, comprehensive databases of human behavioral psychology, and the kind of smile that made experienced negotiators immediately start looking for emergency exits. His presentation to the Emergency Tribunal was a masterwork of comparative evolutionary psychology, legal precedent, and diplomatic fury disguised as scholarly discourse. "The defendants," he explained to the 7-species tribunal, "have demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of Deathworld psychological conditioning. They operated under the assumption that because humans participate in peaceful academic exchange, we have somehow transcended the survival mechanisms that enabled our species to achieve dominance on the most hostile planet in their classification systems." He activated a comprehensive holographic display showing Earth's environmental conditions and threat assessments. My client originates from a world where approximately 74% of native species demonstrate active predatory behaviors, where atmospheric and geological conditions regularly eliminate entire ecosystems, and where the dominant species achieved evolutionary success through pattern recognition that treats coordinated ambush behavior as an immediate existential threat. The Tribunal's presiding officer, an ancient Seraphim energy pattern with millennia of legal experience, reviewed the case documentation with growing fascination. The defendants maintain they intended no permanent harm to the human subject. Intent, Ambassador Chen replied with the kind of precision that made opposing counsel everywhere very nervous, becomes irrelevant when dealing with a species that evolved to interpret group predation as a survival scenario requiring immediate lethal response. They surrounded her, discussed modifying her body without consent, and deployed restraint equipment. In human evolutionary context, that behavioral constellation has exactly one meaning: eliminate the threat or become the victim. However, one of the Thalassian Tribunal members interjected. Surely the response was disproportionate to the proposed action? Hair modification is temporary and reversible. Appendage removal is permanent and traumatic. Ambassador Chen smiled with the expression humans reserved for moments when they were about to deliver information that would permanently alter someone's worldview. They didn't simply threaten hair modification. They demonstrated that they considered her body to be available for experimental manipulation whenever they deemed it academically interesting, without regard for her consent or psychological well-being. He activated another display showing detailed human stress response patterns and psychological profiles. Humans possess what we term escalation recognition, the ability to identify behavioral patterns that typically progress from minor violations to major assaults. My client was confronted by beings who had collectively decided she represented an acceptable test subject for their theories about primitive emotional responses. The question wasn't whether they would escalate their experimental interventions. The question was when and how far. The tribunal deliberated for exactly 57 minutes before reaching the unanimous verdict, all charges dismissed, with formal recommendations that academic institutions throughout the galaxy immediately implement comprehensive coursework on Deathworld psychology and mandatory consent protocols for any research involving sapient subjects. Dex Veranek was fitted with a biosynthetic replacement appendage and required to complete an additional 18 months of study focused specifically on ethical research methodology and informed consent procedures. His dissertation advisor suggested he might want to consider a more theoretical approach to xenocultural analysis. The other participants received formal censures and were mandated to attend extensive sensitivity training regarding cultural awareness, personal autonomy, and the fundamental differences between academic curiosity and predatory behavior. Several transferred to different fields of study, preferring research subjects that couldn't retaliate. Raven returned to her studies with a dramatically altered social environment. Nobody offered to explain basic theoretical concepts to her anymore. Nobody composed academic papers about her species' charming primitive customs. And absolutely nobody suggested informal experiments involving her personal appearance or cultural practices. She also received an unexpected gift from the station's maintenance division, a new molecular cutting tool, professionally calibrated and engraved with the words personal research equipment in 15 galactic languages. But perhaps the most significant outcome of the entire incident was the new regulation that appeared in every academic institution's policy manual throughout known space. It was concise, direct, and became universally known as the Deathworld Interaction Protocol. Species classification as primitive or developing refers exclusively to technological advancement relative to galactic standards. Such classifications do not indicate reduced survival instincts, diminished capacity for violence, or willingness to tolerate behavior that would constitute predatory aggression in their native environment. Personnel are reminded that beings from high-hazard worlds may respond to perceived threats using survival mechanisms evolved for extremely dangerous conditions. Academic interest does not constitute justification for violating consent protocols, regardless of species classification or research objectives. The protocol was distributed to every educational institution, posted in all multi-species facilities, and incorporated into standard orientation materials for interspecies interaction. And at the bottom, in text that somehow carried more authority than everything preceding it, appeared a single sentence that became something of a universal truism. Deathworld survivors didn't earn their classification through academic achievement. Raven completed her doctorate with highest distinction, specializing in exotic matter applications with particular focus on defensive technologies. Her research contributions were cited in academic papers across 43 different star systems and became foundational material in several emerging fields of theoretical physics. She graduated with her hair longer than ever, now braided with fiber optic threads that caught and reflected light like captured starlight, a reminder that some traditions grow stronger when tested rather than weaker.